Now, the rest of the story. Jim had that accordion since he was 16. Ever since his hardware store owner father got it from a member of a traveling carnival. Seems the carny had purchased more than he could pay for and used the accordion to settle his debt. Dad then bought the instrument, brought it home to his son. The boy and his squeeze box were inseparable from then on. It was a true story, and Jim loved to tell it each time before he played his accordion. And then one night he made his professional debut. Jim had moved to New York City. Shortly thereafter, he and a fellow named Hank became best friends, roommates, in fact. They were invited to a party one evening, and Jim brought his accordion. Predictably, Jim told the story about how he and the instrument met, and then both of them entertained until the small hours. It was 3 when Jim and Hank headed for home. But between that party and the subway station was Times Square, and as they crossed the square, Hank got an idea. It was almost pitch dark out there. There was hardly any traffic, the perfect setting for an accordion concert. See if you can draw some people with that thing, Hank urged. Well, Jim flashed a quizzical expression and then a smile, and the two men stopped right there in the middle of Times Square. And bathed in city shadows, Jim started playing his accordion. For long minutes, that music was the only sound in the night. But one by one, an audience assembled. They wore the tattered, unsubstantial clothing of Times Square's round-the-clock habitués. They appeared from around corners and emerged from doorways in which they slept. Bums is what they were. Jim and Hank, dressed in suits and ties, stood amid the swelling assembly of derelicts, and Jim kept playing. Suddenly one of the tramps called out the name of a popular song, and Jim, grinning, honored the request, and another, and still another. The bums applauded. Hank passed his upturned hat. Hank, neatly suited and tied, sought handouts from the ragged, impoverished inhabitants of Times Square, and he got 'em. He got 'em. The festivities might have continued until dawn, had Jim not rudely been interrupted by a hard rap on his back. The rap came from a nightstick that was attached to a New York policeman, and the derelict audience cringed, and the officer angrily admonished Jim and Hank. It had taken a policeman 3 hours, he said, to quiet the Times Square tramps. He said now it would take another 3 hours to get them back to sleep. So I want you both out of here, the officer demanded. And meekly Jim and Hank obeyed the order. Nobody, far as I know, remembers how they split the 9 cents they extracted from Hank's hat. 9 cents. But that's how much their personal appearance was worth back in the early 1930s. That of a hat-passing impresario named Henry Fonda, and a pleasant-faced Pennsylvania-born accordion player named Jimmy Stewart. And now you know the rest of the story.
And now, the rest of the story. Henry Fonda and Jimmy Stewart are among my favorite actors. They were 2 of the greatest stars of Hollywood's golden era. Some of my favorite Henry Fonda films include 12 Angry Men, The Grapes of Wrath, and Young Mr. Lincoln. Among my favorite Jimmy Stewart films are Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, The Shop Around the Corner, oh man, Vertigo, and of course the box office failure turned television hit, It's a Wonderful Life. Now, do y'all have a favorite film of Henry Fonda or Jimmy Stewart that I failed to mention? Well, according to Scott Iman's book, Hank and Jim, the 50-year friendship of Henry Fonda and Jimmy Stewart, they were an odd couple. You know, I wonder if Neil Simon based his play, TV series, and film The Odd Couple on Hank and Jim. In 1932, Hank and Jim were 2 young theater actors sharing an apartment. They struggled to make ends meet. Now remember, this was during the Great Depression and millions of people were out of work. Scott Iman compared Jimmy Stewart to a curious puppy. I can certainly see that. And Harry Fonda to a cat. Whereas Jimmy Stewart was pleasant to be around, Henry Fonda was often contrary and disgruntled. Henry was a liberal Democrat, Jimmy was a Republican, but somehow Henry and Jimmy remained friends for life. One thing Henry and Jimmy shared was a love of cats. Surprisingly, Henry was more taken with cats than Jimmy was. When a stray cat showed up on their doorstep, Henry fed it and named it. Cats are smart creatures. They started figuring this out. The next day, the same stray cat appeared with another stray cat. Other stray cats nearby learned that Henry was a good source of food, and the number of cats grew to where Henry could no longer remember each of their names. Finally, Henry solved this problem by naming all of the stray cats George. It's as good as anything else, I guess. In 1935, Henry and Jimmy decided to try their luck in Hollywood. They moved to Hollywood together, and pretty soon they were once again surrounded by stray cats named George. Now, Jimmy Stewart liked Hollywood. He liked the weather, the environment, and the studio system. You see, to work in films, actors at the time signed contracts, which in most cases meant that they had no choice as to the parts they played. Jimmy Stewart liked the security that MGM provided, but Henry Fonda disliked being under the thumb of anyone, including studio executives. He hated being told what to do and when to do it by anyone. Henry Fonda was a perfectionist when working on films or in theater, and because of this, he was hard on others. Jimmy Stewart was relaxed and easygoing. He was such a nice guy that actress Kim Novak, Jimmy's co-star in Bell, Book and Candle and one of my favorites, Vertigo, she wondered aloud, how can he be so nice and survive Hollywood? But he not only survived, he thrived in Hollywood. Both men thrived on film. Then came World War II. As actors, Henry and Jimmy sold war bonds to raise money for the war effort. Both men wanted to do more than that. In November 1942, Henry joined the Navy because, as he said, I don't want to be in a fake war in a studio. He served in the Navy for 3 years. He was a quartermaster, 3rd class on the destroyer USS Santerly. He eventually rose to the rank of lieutenant in air combat intelligence in the Central Pacific. He earned the Bronze Star Medal and a Navy Presidential Citation. In 1945, 40-year-old Henry was discharged from active duty because the Navy noted he was over age in rank. He was too old to serve his country. But Henry served 3 more years in the Naval Reserve. Jimmy Stewart tried to enlist in the Army in November 1940, but was rejected because of his low weight. Now remember, he was tall and lanky. In February 1941, he tried again and was accepted as a private. Now Jimmy was an experienced pilot, and in March 1941, he reported to the Air Corps, which eventually became the Air Force. Although he was already a pilot, 32-year-old Jimmy Stewart was too old for the required aviation cadet training program. It reminds me of Luke trying to become a Jedi. He's too old to begin the training. The Air Corps made an exception, not because of his fame, but because he was a college graduate and held a commercial pilot's license. Jimmy was commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant on New Year's Day, 1942. Jimmy suddenly realized that his celebrity status was interfering with his desire to fight for his country. The Army used his star power in recruiting films to increase the number of new recruits, which it certainly did, and they also used him to train new pilots at Kirtland Army Airfield in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Hello. Gee, looks like I'm back in the movies again, doesn't it? Well, as a matter of fact, I like to do some talking. Don't go away until I get this thing off. Now, it isn't as if it was a chore for me to talk to you because I want to speak on my favorite subject, the Army Air Forces. I can't speak from long experience. I've only been in the service a year, but I've learned a lot about what the Air Forces have to offer. That's what I want to talk to you about.
In November 1943, Jimmy had had enough of training. He wanted to fight for his country. Finally, his superiors sent him to England as part of the 703rd Bomb Squadron to fly B-24 Liberators. Jimmy Stewart flew numerous missions and earned the Distinguished Flying Cross, the French Croix de Guerre with Palm, and the Air Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters. In March 1945, Jimmy was promoted to full colonel. Following the war, Jimmy became a reserve pilot. He still trained right along with the others. In July 1959, Jimmy became the highest-ranking actor in American history when he was promoted to Brigadier General. He officially retired from the military in 1968 when he reached the mandatory retirement age of 60. Henry and Jimmy appeared in 3 films together: On Our Merry Way in 1948, Fire Creek in 1968, and The Cheyenne Social Club in 1970. Now, both also appeared in the 1962 film How the West Was Won, but they didn't share any scenes together. Jimmy Stewart had a favorite movie horse named Pie, which he often used in his westerns. Jimmy tried to buy that horse, but the owner refused to sell him. When Pie was retired from films, Jimmy purportedly paid to have Pie boarded at an elegant horse farm and went to visit him frequently. Henry Fonda, whose talents outside of stage and screen included painting, knew how much Jimmy loved that horse, so he made a painting of Pie for Jimmy. Jimmy kept Henry's painting in a prominent place in his house for the rest of his life. In the 1970s, Henry Fonda began having heart problems. In 1982, Henry was hospitalized several times, but Jimmy visited him in the hospital every single day. Sometimes Henry and Jimmy reminisced about their years in New York, but they rarely spoke about the movies they made in Hollywood. Other times, Jimmy just sat there in silence. He was there just in case his friend needed anything at all. During one visit to the hospital, Henry fell into a deep sleep. Jimmy talked quietly with Henry's wife at his bedside. Suddenly, Henry awoke and asked, "Is that you, Stewart?" Jimmy replied, Yeah, Hank, it's me." Henry looked at Jimmy and asked, "Well, where's my root beer float?" Now that broke the somber tension in the room, but Henry was serious. He wanted his root beer float. Henry and Jimmy's friendship ended only because of death. 77-year-old Henry James Fonda died on August 12, 1982. 89-year-old James Maitland Stewart died on July 2, 1997. But with their films, they have a sort of immortality. These BFFs, best friends forever, live on the silver screen for you and me to enjoy. Now, before I go, I just wanted to take a moment to let you know that my new book, The Trap, The Untold Story of Sheriff Henderson Jordan in the Final Pursuit of Bonnie and Clyde, is finally available on Amazon and other book retailers. You can get a signed copy from me if you like by scanning this QR code or visiting hendersonjordan.com. I hope you'll enjoy reading it as much as I enjoyed researching it. I'm Brad Dison. Thanks for watching. And now you know the rest of the story.